Welcome back in Solitude with me, DJ Hero. Today we're going to go over mixing drums and percussion. In electronic music, the percussion is definitely vital, especially the kick drum, which I believe is sort of the centerpiece of most electronic dance tracks. In this video, I'm going to go over how I typically process my sounds, balancing the mix, bussing individual sounds together, EQ, compression, saturation, reverb, and a few other tips that you might find useful in your own production. So let's get started. First, I'm going to go over the kick drum because, like I said, I feel that is the focal point and the constant in all of my tracks. You'll see here I have just a basic 8-bar loop, if you will, setup of a kick, snare, clap, a few hi-hat elements, toms, etc. So let's start with the kick. First things first, I always keep my kick drum in mono. As you'll see, I have a utility first in line on the chain here. I've kicked it to mono. Just keep that kick in the center of the mix. This particular kick is a giant kind of big bass-heavy 808. We'll give that a listen. A little something from a new track I'm working on. I've got a little saturation next in line after the utility here. This is to give a little warmth, a little distortion without it being all fuzzy and distorted. It's only 50% wet. Pushing the drive a little bit. Standard analog clip is kind of what I was going for there. I typically will go back and forth between the analog clip and the sine or the sinoid fold. I really like how that one sounds as well, but this one seemed to work well. Maybe it's the key that it kicks between C and F, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly. After the saturator, I have an EQ, which is really rolling off everything below 20 hertz and everything above 16,000 hertz. Those are typically frequency ranges that A, the human ear can't hear, typically speaking, and B, more importantly, they are ranges that the average everyday clubs or sound system setup can't reproduce. So rather than deal with what might be in those ranges eating into the overhead that I have, I just shave them off to help keep overhead and keep the mix clean. And you'll see I've got a little bit of gain staging here because that saturator does make it a little bit louder. So I have turned the output levels down on the EQ to prevent it from clipping, right? Pretty simple. And then the last thing I have in the chain here is just a limiter. And what the limiter is doing, I have the threshold set to what it's peaking at, what it's generally peaking at. And then I have my ceiling set at -7 decibels. I have found over the years that -7 decibels is perfect for me and how I mix down my tracks. I will not touch the kick drum once I have it set in the mix. I will leave it right where it is. If something starts to get muddy, or I start losing my ability to hear the kick drum the way I want to, I will go and fix everything else before I touch what I've done to the kick drum here. Like I said, I feel the kick drum is sort of the staple. It's the centerpiece of all the big electronic tunes, especially big room bass tracks, things I like to make and play. So I like to set it as a constant and have everything else as the variable, right? You can't solve an equation if you don't have at least one constant. Don't hate me in the comments. I'm not a mathematician. I'm just using it as an example. But that's basically my kick drum. You'll see that I have as far as the mixing goes, I have the output set to 0. I'm letting the limiter actually set the level of that track. Next, we have the snare elements, snare clap elements. I have a snare, a clap that's layered with it, and I have this snap hitting on every other for texture. So let's start with the snare. So this snare I'm treating like the meat of those three sounds, the main portion of those three sounds. So the first thing I did, again, I have a utility on here, kicking the snare, this particular sound to mono. And then I have a frequency shifter, 100% wet. What I'm using the frequency shifter for is to help tune it. to my kick drum so that tonally speaking, they fit better. Another way you could do this is if you had it, say, in your sampler or in a simpler, you could move up and down the keyboard and the piano roll. I always tend to work with audio forms, waveforms on an audio channel, so the frequency shifter is just a quick and easy way to achieve that fine tuning, if you will. The next thing I have on the snare here is a drum bus. With the transients pulled all the way back, a little soft clip on the drive here, drive up a little bit, a little dampening. It's really here, because this is kind of the body of what I'm going for between these three sounds. I'm using this drum bus to just really create some punch. Without it, you get a lot of the tail. And I didn't want the tail wash on that. I really just wanted the attack. So it's cleaning up the transient there, or at least accenting the transient. Next in line, my EQ. I've rolled off everything below 150 hertz. That seems to be where I like to cut a lot of sounds, drums especially. You can see with what's below it kind of still back there ghostly. All these frequencies, I want to save that room for the kick drum or other similar sounds that may need them, bass lines, things like that. This is a 808 driven tune that I was working on, so that kick drum, that 808 kick is going to take up all that space. So I've basically rolled off, and I've treated this EQ like a high pass filter to clean that space out so that it's saved for the kick drum. And then similarly, I've got my EQ set up so that I'm cutting everything above 16,000 hertz. Again, we can't hear it. Our ears can't hear it, but I can see there's a signal out here, so just shaving it off. Because of the way that I've got the setup on the drum bus, it was really pumping the level on here, so I turned it down 8 decibels so that it wasn't peaking, right? And then the last thing I have on this sound is the general, just your basic glue compressor. I have it set at a 30 attack, really quite slow, and what that's doing is it's really making it snappy, right? I'm treating this glue compressor sort of like parallel compression, where on parallel compression maybe you'd have it set up on a send or a return channel. I'm just doing it with the glue compressor here. The ratio's as high as the glue compressor goes at 10. The release, I left that at its basic 6. I suppose I could adjust it a little bit depending on the length of the sample. The 6 seemed to work for me. But really what I want is the snap of that snare. And then I've turned the dry wet back so that I can introduce the body of the snare back in, but accentuate that attack a bit more. The reason I've done it like this on this sound is because the next sound, the clap sound, that's where I want the tail of my clap snare combo, if you will, to come from. Let's go to that one. Before I do go to that one, for now, the level is at 0. We'll get to that as I get through all the other sounds. But moving on to the clap here, this guy, you see we got a lot more going on down here. Primarily, I have created this effects rack and have 2 chains. One is the main, where I have done a little frequency shifting to, again, tune the sample to the kick drum and to the snare. I felt that by bringing it down this 120 hertz, it sat better orally speaking with the snare. The next in line, the EQ, again, kind of cut similar to the snare, rolling off everything below 150 hertz, and then staged output-wise so that it wasn't peaking. And then I have a little saturation on this one. I really am pushing this one a bit. I really wanted to make the snare that I used, which I believe is just a basic 808 snare, if I'm not mistaken, looking at the waveform. Yeah. But what I wanted to do is really make it crunchy, so I pushed that drive as, you know, just a good warm level. And you can see I've used the sinoid fold on this one. Again, I happen to like the crunchiness that creates. And then a little glue compression. Again, this particular one, I wasn't going for that parallel push like I was on the snare where I got that snap. This one was just kind of to bring in the peaks and reduce the dynamic range as a whole. I'm going to hold off on the drum bus here. Instead, I'm going to go to the second in the chain, which is the stereo. So you hear it's a lot thinner, but it's also a lot wider. What I've got here, first thing I have is a delay on here, 100% wet. And what the delay is doing is really just offsetting the start, if you will, of both the left and right channel. That's actually what's creating the width. You could check one of my previous videos where I go over creating some stereo width using the native Ableton delay. This FabFilter Timeless, again, as you guys have probably picked up by now, I love all of the FabFilter products. They're great. They're great. They sound great. They process everything beautifully, and they've got really just nice interfaces to see what's going on. But basically, the delay here is what's creating the width. Next in line, I have the frequency shifter. It's set to what the other one on the main channel is. Again, tuning the sample to the snare. After that, we have our EQ. This one, I've rolled off a little bit more because I don't want that mid-range to be wider. I really just want the high range of that clap to be wider. And then when we layer back in the mono version of the sample, you'll get more of the body in the center and the width, the high end, the breadth, if you will, on the wider edges, the left and right, the stereo edges. After the EQ, a little saturation set up just like on the main, really keeping the sounds to be the same. After that, on this channel though, on the wide version, I have an OTT, really bringing out the high end, crunching it together, squeezing together. Ableton really nailed it with the built-in OTT. If you're not in Ableton, the same company that makes Serum, Xfer, has a version of the OTT. Doesn't quite sound exactly the same, but it is pretty close. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's a free download if you want to swing by their site and check it out. But I'm using it to squish it in, just kind of crunch it together and really bring out the width and high end. And then when we bring them both together, you can see here I've kind of done a little mixing to kind of set them how I like them. You know, like right in there. And then after these sounds, collapse these really quick, I have a drum bus bringing everything back together, kind of pushing the wider sound and the narrow sound, just pushing them together, giving me just kind of a little bit of a glue. Could have used a glue compressor, could have used my FabFilter C2 or C, but I like the way the drum bus, the Ableton drum bus, really allows you to fiddle with the transients and bring it out. And I set these adjustments how I like this based on the snare when layered with it. So I had that kind of warmth in this snare, by the way, is a 909 snare that's been really crushed down and then reprocessed, as I showed just a minute ago. Layered with the 808 clap, I like the crunch with the warmth of that snare. So that's how I've got that set. And then this snap is just another sound, just adding a little variation. Just a simple little snap, like a finger snap, that I've added some reverb to. Let's go to that one. Really quite simple. I've got the Pro R, any reverb will do. And it's just kind of giving a little wash to that snap. And when you layer it in, I suppose I could have just added reverb to either the snare or the clap, but in the actual version of this track that I'm working on a full track of, the snap has a part where it's all by itself, so it's on its own channel. And then I've kind of given them these three sounds. I've given a little bit of a mix down. So not enough clap, too much clap. And what I'm kind of looking for here is just that balance that I like with respect to these three sounds and how they sit together. You know, for your own track, it might be a little bit different. Maybe, you know, you want more of the clap, you want it a little brighter or not as much, whatever the case may be. For me, this was the feeling I was really kind of vibing on for these three sounds specifically in this track. All right, well, moving on to the closed hats here, a little loop that I made. For those of you who do know me, I refuse to use pre-made loops. In this particular instance, what I did is I took this kind of ride here, and then with using individual instances of that sample, shortened them up, so we had kind of the closed hat. And then this one accent in the loop here with that one instance of the open hat. And I like how it sits, kind of plays that open hat, kind of rides into the snare. Right? As far as the processing on this one goes, I've got a little bit of auto pan. If you're not in Ableton, Pancake is a great panning emulator. Basically what it does is it pans left and right at the desired rate. You could do this one, you can set to the actual tempo of the track, or you can set it to the specific hertz. If you want to do it a bit more freely, turn the amount up to where you like it there. I happen to like the way it bounces back and forth. Another kind of avenue I could have gone if you wanted to stand out is I could use basic panning to kind of give it a little space of its own in the mix, if you will. There's a bit to the, one side but in relation to the other sounds going on in the mix here. But this particular loop and the way it sits in the mix, I really was a fan of that panning there. The next thing in line here is an EQ, and this I have set cutting off quite a bit. Obviously, you can see here the sound itself doesn't have a whole lot of range in the frequencies below where I'm at, but this cutoff is set to 7,500 hertz, rolled down a little bit. It's the hi-hat. I really just want that brightness, that kind of sizzle on top, if you will. Basically, I'm using the EQs on all of these sounds. This one in specific right now, cutting off, scooping out the frequencies that aren't necessary, that aren't needed. This sound without the EQ, if I wanted that more mid-range knock, I'd adjust back the EQ and leave it out there. But some of the things that I'm going to put in the song and the rest of the musical elements are going to use that mid-high range, so I'm just cutting it out so that it kind of floats in there on top of the bass line sounds and some of the melody aspects that I've added later on. And then what I basically did here is I leveled it with my clap snare combo so that when I just sit and listen, they, to my ears, sit relatively the same. I've balanced how I'm hearing them. I want them to be relatively the same level. Next sound in line here is the open hat, which kind of your basic house loop, if you will. Not a whole lot going on this one either. First in line, I have a utility making the sound mono. The reason I've chosen to go with mono, couple, but in relation to the drums themselves, is I have the closed hats panning back and forth. So I don't necessarily need the open hat to fill that space when I have my closed hat doing it. Additionally, because of some of the stereo aspect I added to the clap, that clap will also be filling some of that space, that wider space. So basically what I've done at the open hat here is I have kind of created a little space by making the clap wide and the closed hats wide for the open hat to sit in between them. And that will also play into a lot of the other sounds in the song as a whole. My bass line is a little wider. Some of the keys that are in the track are also wider. Right, if you have some powerful or strong elements that are wide in your overall mix, a lot of your small elements you might want to specifically place within the spaces that those wide elements aren't using. In this particular case, the open hat, I just kept it mono. And then next in line, I have the EQ, also rolling off quite a bit. Not as much as the closed hats, because I do like some of the body, the mid-high range of that open hat. This is what it sounds like without it. With it. All right, I've kind of scooped out a lot of this range right in here. Just not necessary for what I'm going for. And it frees up a lot of that space, kind of this space right in here, for my bass line. All right? If this space down here is for my 808 sub, then I'm going to need this space for my bass line and many of my musical elements that come later on in the track. And then the last element, well, maybe not the last, there is one more after that, but I have an 808 tom, simple little sound, just kind of triggering into a little loop. Simple, not a whole heck of a lot going on there. A little saturation to warm it up. Here's what it is without it. And it's just adding a tiny bit of fuzz. And then the EQ, again, what I've got here is this one, rolling off everything below 70 hertz, not quite as high up at the 150 mark like the snare and clap. The reason being here is the majority of this sound is at the 70 to 100 hertz range. Just look at the graph, right? And then I've rolled off some of the top. Hi-hats are going here. There's not much of the sound over here. So what I'm doing is scooping out wherever I can frequencies to save room for something else, right? There's a little tick right there. So let me back off just a little bit. So that's just space I've saved. Keeping it clean. Any transients or floating frequencies out there, they're gone now. Don't have to worry about them. And I can use that space for my hi-hats or any other sounds, atmospheric sounds, effects, things like that. That could fill that space. Now here's the last sound that we have in the mix here is the cymbal. Just a crash at the top of the loop. I don't do a whole heck of a lot, but use an EQ to cut out the low. It's not really necessary what's down there. Again, for all the same principles that I've talked about on the previous sounds, is I want to save this space for the important stuff. Cymbal crash, not overly important, but I do like them to, symbolize the beginning of the measure or the bar, to accentuate the drop, if you will, whatever the case may be. The crash is an important aspect of the song. It's just not a big one. But here's what it is without it. Here's what it sounds like with it. just cleaning it up a little bit. And then the next step, once I have all of the sounds processed the way I wanted, EQ, saturation, compression, things like that. When it comes to the drums, the next step that I'll do is I'll grab them all and I'll group them together and create my perc bus so that they're all now routing through one channel before they're going to the master. It allows me to process them all together on this one channel. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the kick back out of this group. I'm going to send it right back to the master so that it's not going to the bus. Like I said, the kick drum, I keep constant in my mixes. Once I've got it set, I don't mess with it. I don't want it being affected by any bus compression that I'm going to do with the rest of the drums. It is my staple. It's just my rock, right? It's not going to change. So I'm just going to put it straight to the master. And then the cymbal, I don't want to affect the same way either. I'm not going to send this one to the master. Instead, what I've got over here is a pre-bus, a pre-master bus that I'm going to send it to. And I do that on every one of my tracks. I bus all the sounds that go together. The percussion sounds, they get their own bus. All the bass line sounds, they get their own bus. All of the melodies, synths, pads, things like that, they get their own bus. All the vocals get their own bus. All the FX, the swooshes and the atmospheric stuff and the white noise, they all get their own bus. And then once they're all bussed together, I can mix all the sounds a bit more easily and send them to the pre-master where I can give a little bit, again, just a little bit of multi-band to the master. Boom, now we're in the final stages. So here we are back in the percussion bus. I've taken the kick and the cymbal crash out of the bus, and here's what we're working with. We got a little bit of peaking. Now, you'll see that none of the channels are peaking, so we did all the gain staging right with respect to that. We don't want any peaking. We don't want any of that. So that will be the first thing we tackle. But before we do that, I'm just going to listen and make sure that I'm comfortable and happy with kind of the preliminary mix down. Make sure everything's balanced. Make sure I'm hearing the snare, the clap, the hi-hats, and the toms all at the levels I want them to be at. Tom might be a little loud for what I want here. Now, to save a little bit of overhead on that tom and to give it a little bit of its own space, what I think I want to do is pan it just a little bit to one side so that it's not directly in the center of the mix, and to allow the fact that it is no longer centered in the mix to be an advantage, in that once I pull it to one side or the other, it will kind of stand out a little bit more, and I won't need it to be as loud to get the same audible effect. So perfect. I like it. I'm going to mute the snares for a minute. Just hear my hi-hats. I think they sound well together, balanced well. The open hat may be a little loud. We'll turn that down a little bit. We'll integrate one sound at a time here, starting with the main snare. And I'll bring the clap in. That's good. Now let's bring the snap. I like it. I like it. And thankfully, those few adjustments have almost eliminated the peaking issue. So the first thing I'll do is I'll drop an EQ on the channel, and turn it down, whatever is necessary to prevent it from peaking. I always let it run through a little bit to just allow a little build up from the reverb, to allow everything to kind of really peek through and give me an honest peak level. So we're at positive 2 above. So I'll bring it down 2.5, give us a little bit of overhead. There we go, nice and clean. All right, so from here, this is where the fun begins. We're gonna do a few things. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add another EQ because it's gonna allow me to create a group of effects here, an audio effects rack. And if you're not in Ableton, you might want to read up on how your DAW will do this or what will allow you to do this. It may require some busing. I know Pro Tools would allow you to send the signal to several different, fairly certain, or maybe the new FL Studio. I know Logic can. But essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a few different versions of the sound. This will be our main one, so I'll just label this as main. And then going back through all of the sounds that are actually feeding through the bus, I'm gonna take the EQ and roll off whatever I need to match the lowest one. Now the toms, if you recall correctly, I had rolled off at 70 hertz. So that's the lowest frequency range of all the sounds that are currently running through the bus. So that's where I'm going to roll this EQ off at. And then I'm going to grab just a basic compressor. Again, I could use any compressor that I'm most comfortable with. I happen to like the basic glue compressor. So what I want to do here, I'm going to set this to 10 so I get a little bit of that attack, the little bite on the transient there. The release probably fine at 6, and the ratio I'm going to leave at 4. Actually, no, I'm going to start it at 2 and we'll see what goes on. Just a quick bit of advice here with regards to your plugins. Sometimes starting extreme, like the max, will give you a good idea, the most bold, clear idea of what that effect is doing, and then you can back off the effect to the desired sound that you want. So I've got the threshold now all the way at negative 40 dB for this one, and now I'll just back up until I'm comfortable with where it's at. And on this particular one, I really just want a little bit of grip. Almost like the EQ is really just kind of giving a firm hug. Not a weak hug, not an overly aggressive one, just a firm one, you know, the one that you just want to sit in for a little while. 100% on this one. As far as the dry wet goes, I'm not going to mess with the clip on this one. It's not actually hitting that range. If I were to start driving the makeup, then we'd see that. I'm not worried about that at the moment. We're going to worry about that in a minute. But for now, I just want a little grip. Right about 5 dB on this one. Perfect, perfect. Then the next step here, I'm going to create a new one. This one, I'm going to label, how do you spell parallel? I don't know that that's right. You can at me in the comments below. I'm going to grab the EQ from the first one, pull it down, and let's mute the main one for this moment here. I'm going to grab another glue compressor. Now this one I'm going to set with the ratio at 10 and the attack at 30. The release probably pretty good where it's at. Again, 100% on the wet, and then I'm going to drive that threshold all the way down, and then what we're going to hear is really biting on the attack. You're going to get a lot more of that snap in the attack. And because of all of the things that are going on, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to adjust the release to maximize the snap of the attack so that the compressor is kind of restarting more quickly. Right? The shorter the release time, the faster the compressor is going to let go. So it's like you have something, you grab it, you let go. You grab it, you let go, right? The attack set at 30 milliseconds means 30 milliseconds of the sound is going to play normal until the compressor grabs, and then at the set release time, it's going to let go. So the faster the release time, the more quickly the compressor is going to reset and allow the attack through again. If we were to set it all the way up here, we've lost the bite of the attack. So we want it to be faster. That's maybe too fast. So I think 4. 4 sounds good. Yeah, I like 4. Now, I'm going to turn this all the way down so we don't have it. Turn the main back on, and I'm going to mix in the parallel until we get a little punch in all these drums, right? That's good. That's good. So without it, with it. Really gives a little snap to that snare. I really dig that. You could also accomplish this same effect by adding a return or a send track and putting your compressor on that. The advantage of doing it that way is you then have the parallel compression at your ready for any sound, not just your drums. I don't use a whole heck of a lot of parallel compression for any other sound, so I don't bother creating its own unique return or send track. I just created an audio effects track here, and that seems to work for me. If your DAW doesn't have the ability to create an effects rack like this, that send track may be the way for you to do it, the best way for you to do it. And then next, I'm going to mute these again, just so that I'm starting from scratch. We're going to create one more, and this one I'm going to call Saturation. I'm going to grab my EQ. All right. Just the same EQ that's on the other 2 channels here. And then I'm going to grab my favorite saturator. It's not the built-in Ableton one. It's the FabFilter Saturn. But the reason I like this one is it allows me to kind of create bands. It's kind of almost got its own EQ built in. I'm not going to, in this setting, I have this crossover at 150 hertz, so everything below the bassy part that I've saved for the kick. I'm not going to mess with that at all. There's going to be no saturation on those ranges of sound, those frequencies, which you can see that Tom hits just a little bit of. This range, which is 150 to 2000 hertz, my mid-range here, that's where the bulk of my saturation is going to be. So I've got my mix at 50%. I'm actually going to kick that all the way up to 100 because the other 2 channels are creating my mix, if you will. I'm going to bring my dynamics up so we get a little bit of noise, a little bit of grunge in that saturation, if you will. I'm going to really push the drive all the way up, like I said, and then back off of it until we found where I like it. Right about there, right about there. Okay. And then we'll move over here to the high end. Again, I'm going to kick this all the way up to 100. I'm going to add a little bit adjustment on my dynamics here. I don't want it as much because I want to keep the high end a little cleaner and less sizzling. But let's brighten this up a bit. Turn up the saturation. That's an awful lot. I don't think I like that, so let's back that off. Right there. Now, this whole time, I have really just been eyeballing. I've just been listening. I haven't used any sort of metering. But let's go to the master. I'll bring up my meter here and kind of take a look at what's going on. Again, I'm just trying to keep it balanced, and if we look at this, it's fairly balanced. That mid-range is a little heavy duty, so I can either turn the whole channel up, which I think I will, or I can kind of mess with the EQ a bit on it, but let's turn this up just a little bit. Kind of so that they're similar. Now this little range here, right around the 2700, 2800, which I believe is right in this. Yeah, so I'm going to bring that out a little bit. Obviously not as extreme, but again, take the effect to the extreme and then back off so that you can find really where you like it. Okay, I like it. I like it. Now, same as before, I'm going to turn it all the way down. We'll turn these back on. I'm going to bring it in. How are we sounding as far as balance goes? Highs are a little high. We'll get there in a second. Maybe I can turn it down just a little bit here. Bring it back just a bit. It sounds a bit distorted. Kind of what we're going for, but just want a little bit, a little harmonics on the kind of the texture in the background. So without it, with it. And you hear it really warmed up the mids nicely. The highs are a little crispy, or not necessarily crispy, but a little high. But here's where we take the next step. And this is, again, my way of doing things. I'm going to grab another instance of that glue compressor. This particular one, I'm going to set the attack around 3. I'm going to leave the release where it is now. I'm going to turn the ratio down to 2. This is what it sounds like, really pushed, which isn't what I'm going for here. Really what I want is gentle, just gentle. I dig it. I'll let a little bit of the dry signal through as well. Excellent. All right, so then for me, my last step on this chain, well, maybe not my last step, but on the chain of effects here, one more EQ. Again, I'm going to set this at 70 because that's where the tom was set. And I'm going to just kind of do a little extra balancing. Only this particular case, I'm going to pay attention to the stereo edges, the left and right, the width of the top part of the sound, the high end of the sound, and then the mid-range more in the center. The fab filter makes it really easy. I'm going to create a notch, right-click the notch, go to stereo placement, mid, and I'm going to bring that up. If we bring it all the way up, a little too much, but let's push it a little bit, widen that out a little bit. All right, perfect. Now I'm going to go over here and create one like this, but this one, I'm going to right-click, stereo placement, sides. So now it's sitting on the edges. And this is going to allow me to bring a little more breadth to the top end in the stereo edges. Right, I can go, which really brings it out by being obnoxious, turning it all the way up. But that's not what I want. So let's reset my meter. Looks pretty well balanced. Reset that, make sure we're not peaking. Perfect. I like it. Now, with this set the way that I have it set here, Obviously, these are just drums by themselves. So as you add more sounds, you're going to want to come into an EQ and make little adjustments, right? I know my bass line takes quite a bit of space up in this range, so I might need to scoop the drums down a little in here, or roll a little off of here on the edge to make room for the 808. We're just processing the drums right now, getting them at a good working starting point for your entire mix. Now, the last step I'll do from here is I have a send over here set up with a little reverb. It's just a little drum plate, right? And I'll take, perfect, that's not clipping. And this is the send. We'll add a little reverb. I like it. Perfect, perfect. So now that we've got these drums mixed and processed, let's add the kickback. And make sure that the attack of the kick and the bass of the kick are where we want them. So I think that the drums are a little behind the kick. I have a little bit of overhead here. So I'm going to turn this up 2 decibels. And then bring it down. I like that. That's good. And then the last sound to add back will be the cymbal crash. Now, obviously we're not putting any reverb on the kick, but I do want a little warmth and a little wetness on the cymbal crash. I have 2 other sends set up. A is a large room reverb. Which don't want all of it, but. And then C is a delay. So probably right around there. A little more. Good, I like that. Perfect. So let's check it out as a whole. We've got a pretty good balance in the meter. If I just stop, close my eyes, and give it a listen, it all sounds pretty well balanced to me. I make bass music, so your bass is probably going to ride a little high. I like it that way. And in fact, when it comes to my mastering stage, when the whole track is all flushed out and all of the other elements are put in it, this works to my advantage. So this is an intentional having the sub portion be higher than the rest. But yeah, looking over here, we've got a little play in the stereo spectrum, which by design, I like it. Works well for what I want. And there we have it. How I go about mixing and processing my drums. I find that it works well for me making breaks, making trance, making house, drum step, dubstep. I haven't put it to good use in drum and bass a whole heck of a lot. That's not my area of expertise, but I imagine it probably worked pretty well just the same. But there it is. There you have it. If you have any questions regarding the tutorial, drop them in the comments below. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to hear more from me, type Originaldjhero, all one word, into SoundCloud, Mixcloud, Twitter, and Instagram, or search DJ Hero on Beatport if you want to purchase some music. And until next time, good luck in your own projects. We'll see you soon.